Welcome to the Data Center Hawk podcast. Today we're talking about 5 shifts that are happening in the data center industry.
We've been in this industry now for over 15 years, and it's dynamic, and it's changing, and we've never been in a market like we're in right now.
You're listening to the Data Center Hawk podcast, where we demystify the data center market. Data Center Hawk is your online platform for data and commentary on the data center market. Stay tuned and be sure to join the thousands of others who rely on datacenterhawk.com to make decisions in the data center space.
Well, David, it has been some time since you and I have been on a podcast together. Last one you did solo, you rudely disinvited me from the invites. Well, I showed up and there was no one there.
That is not true. Do not believe that, people.
I was much out of town.
Yes, that's right. Summer.
So today we're talking about shifts that are happening in the space, which I think has accentuated over the course of this year. Before we do that, you were recently at DataCloud, and by recently I mean yesterday.
Yes.
DataCloud conference in Austin, Texas. Yeah. I'd love to hear from you, like takeaways from that conference, or what you learned, interesting thoughts from that deal.
Yes. Well, it's good to be back, obviously, with you here, and then also with everyone else. So, I think the takeaways for me from that event, I mean, number one, we're certainly around how the shifting economy is impacting the industry in as a whole, but also regionally. That's certainly something that everybody's paying attention to. There's, issues with availability of power all throughout the world, and so that is something that really comes up in a lot of the discussions because, obviously our industry is the demand for power is what drives our business, but also just the sustainability piece and how to make sure that people are really focused on areas that they should be so that this isn't a problem down the road. Was there
any talk of solutions to put it bluntly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we obviously have a lot of smart people in our industry, and there's definitely a focus on how to accentuate or accelerate the renewable energy usage in our business. But a lot of it is, I was actually in one panel or listening to one panel talk about the difference between the aspirational and what you can actually do. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of firms that have some very aspirational goals. And the challenge is, how do you get there? And it's really hard. And the fact is, there's only a certain amount of companies themselves that have the resources and things to actually do the things that they're trying to do, And so, it is clear that both the power, certainly the power side of things, the water, people that are focused on water are trying to figure out how to solve these issues. And there are some good solutions, but none of them are easy. And we talked about it. I was talking with our analyst team today. All of them are very complex on how to solve and the right way to solve and how quickly you can solve them and how much the solutions cost. So in a nutshell, it was great. I mean, it's, one thing, it's our industry just gathering and sharing ideas. I mean, I'm always very encouraged because I feel like we're part of an industry that's growing, that's focused on how to grow in the right way. And that takes a lot of intentional thought, time, and to figure out.
Yeah, I think my takeaways from when I was in Austin back in April was that, there's not really a silver bullet technology out there necessarily, and that is things are going to grow and shift over time.
There we go. Ding.
Yeah, that's right. Ding. Noted. That's consistent with my understanding as well.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else from DataCloud?
No, there's I think, it's, I was talking to somebody while I was there. There's a lot of data center conferences that are going on, which is fun. You can probably be at one every week if you wanted to. But it's really fun to have our industry kind of meeting again. And it certainly feels a lot more like it did, several years before the pandemic, which is great.
Yeah. All right. So before we talk what we see are some of the bigger shifts happening in space, let's talk about what hasn't changed.
Okay.
So what are some of the internal dynamics to the space that haven't changed, in the last 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, I think demand certainly hasn't changed as it relates to going away. I think one of the question marks a lot of people had around the last several years of growth in our space is, when do we get to the digestion period specific to the demand? I think we're getting to a digestion period specific to the supply, which we've never had before, but the demand hasn't changed. I mean, it is there both from the hyperscale perspective, It is certainly there from the enterprise side of things. So these are companies that have like 500 kW to 2 to 3 megawatt type of power requirements in the market. That certainly is still active. So the demand side has really continued to be aggressive to try to figure out how can we solve, the challenges we have on an infrastructure standpoint. I think that energy still is, electricity is really hard to figure out. That was before. That is now. Focus on, renewable energy. That has not changed. And we continue to see, vacancy rates decline. And that's really across most markets, whether it's a primary or secondary market. There's just not a lot of available capacity out there. So in the midst of a market that has shifted significantly over the last 12 to 18 months, there are some things that are still the same, and that's one of the reasons that this is an exciting industry to be in.
Yeah, and still demand is generally located, not that it hasn't moved outside of, but is still in the major markets.
Yeah,
North America, Europe, APAC as well, they're still getting theirs, as it were.
Yeah.
But, as we'll see, that's going out into some of the secondaries.
Yeah, and that's exciting because there's a lot of areas that would love to attract data center demand. Community sentiment is shifting related to, which we'll get into a little bit, which, related to data center demand. So it's making areas that traditionally have not been able to bring those companies and those type of requirements to the market more attractive.
All right, so let's move now. Let's shift to shifts.
Gosh.
I'm going to do that every time we introduce a new topic. Every bullet point you see on this is a... All right. The first one, let's talk about timing. So this is related to a point you made earlier about some of the economic environment of just supply chain, inflation, et cetera, labor shortages.
Yep.
So how has that changed the timing from a data center, kind of development and delivery standpoint?
Yeah, when if you were in this market pre-pandemic, there were some frameworks you had built in your mind around how data center developments typically would go. You would buy land, you would get power to the site, you could basically put up a shell and the infrastructure anywhere from like 6 to 12 months, 6 months at the fastest. And there might be some companies that said they could do a little faster than that, whatever. Let's just say 6 to 12 months. Yeah. So that was kind of the frameworks that we built around. All of that has changed. There's reason. It's an industry challenge. It's not like a provider by provider challenge, but with the supply chain challenges that have been out in the market, with issues with even like the users and their ability to start in the space when they're contracted to. I mean, that's been a problem because they don't have the equipment to do it. They can't the space has been turned on by the data center operator, but they can't put their equipment in there because some of their equipment they don't have. Yeah. So all of these are new shifts to the space, to the industry that we haven't seen. And so it's created a lot of issues. These issues are everywhere. They're not just in Phoenix or Chicago or Dallas. They're not just in Canada. I mean, they're across the globe because of the environment that we've been in, and we've talked about it before. It's not going away. It's not like something that can be solved in a 3-month time period. This is something that has really got to be thought through on how equipment is bought, where it is shipped. All those things to make sure that these requirements can continue to be served.
I think something we've seen, maybe 2 years, 3 years ago, if a customer didn't have the equipment, they would probably have maybe waited to sign the lease, where now you kind of have this land rush dynamic going on where there's a pressure, or at least a feeling that if you don't lock some space up now, you're not going to have the opportunity in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And that it's almost like they're reinforcing each other, the inability to deliver the supply and the inability to fill it, but yet they're still securing the space, which is a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and there's I know there's buildings being built today that are like currently under construction that the power timeline has been pushed back, so the building will deliver and it will not have power for a certain amount of time, and that's really not happened before in our industry. And it's not the developer's fault. It's just the way that the electricity, the power has changed. The companies have changed the way they are delivering power. So I think the biggest, when I think about just the timing of these projects, which is so important to, especially when you sign a contract on when you can deliver, but your ability to deliver, if you're like a data center operator, depends on all of the people doing what you've asked them to do and what they've been contracted to do, and that's just not as easy as it was was 2 to 3 years ago. So all those things from a timing standpoint have changed, and that's created an environment we've never been in before in our space.
You mentioned all the power stuff, and also you mentioned at DataCloud, like almost every talk you went to, people had mentioned or addressed the Northern Virginia Dominion Energy talk. Sure. What was the consensus thought on that?
Yeah, I think that issues like that are going to push demand to different places. That certainly is one. Two is that we have some really what have been bankable markets and bankable groups that, there's question marks now around what they can deliver. And so regardless of what the reasons for that stuff is, the point is that, our industry values, consistency and reliability, obviously, and the ability for people to execute. And these contracts are so large, the development projects, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And you look at some of these campuses over a 20-year period, there will be billions of dollars spent there. So when the ground underneath you starts to shift a little bit, not literally in our space.
Hopefully not. Although NTT's got that facility that will shake on its foundations. We've all seen the video. It's pretty cool.
The ground is not shaking. I just mean figuratively that when that happens, it really puts a kink in things and makes it hard for people to think if, hey, one of the most reliable areas is starting to be challenged, what does that mean for some of the other areas that are out there? So I think it illustrates a challenge that is out there in multiple markets across the world.
Yeah. Okay, as you'll see, all these are kind of interrelated. Yeah. The next one is like pricing.
Yep.
So I think we've talked about in this podcast before, maybe the last quarterly wrap up is pricing going up, anywhere from 5 to 10% in what I'll call established markets. Sure. Markets that were relatively stabilized from a pricing standpoint. We're now seeing those tick upwards, which is again first time we've seen that in 10 plus years.
Yep.
So again, some of this is due to just supply chain, almost like pass through costs, challenges around labor.
Yep.
And so that's true. To what extent do you think either are or will be some of the, if you strip out supply chain and inflation, the supply demand dynamics that are what they are, which in any other industry would lead to price increases.
Yep.
Do you think those have been priced in yet, or will they be in the future?
I think they're starting to be priced in. I wouldn't say that all of the price increases have been related to this, the fact that there's only a few options in a market. Most of that increase, I think, has been driven by the provider cost rising and that being passed along, and a lot of the companies that are leasing these facilities, they understand because many of them build their own, and so they see those pricing changes as well. But I think your comment around the percentages increasing, I think that's accurate. I think in some markets it's higher than that. 10% is probably more in like the 20% range. We've never seen this before in our market. One of the challenges with raising prices, significantly is that these customers that, there's a smaller amount of customers that lease the larger amount of space. And so they have a lot of leverage in our space, which makes sense. But I don't see this changing. If you're a data center owner, if you're a building owner, any type of real estate, not just data center, but think industrial, office, whatever, you don't want people moving out, right? Churn is not a good thing. Well, in a market where the pricing is increasing, it starts to become a good thing. Or in a market when it's hard to get capacity, if you have 5 to 10 megawatts coming back to the market, historically that would not be a good thing. Now it's a great thing. When you can take that space that you thought you were going to lease for, $90 kW, and now you might be able to lease it for $120. Like, it's a much different issue. Yeah. So
makes sense. Math checks out.
Yeah, we've never had that. That opportunity has never presented itself in our industry. So that change is really interesting today.
Do you think, it seems like over the last year to two, specifically like Dallas is a great example where all the supply uptake was taken out, and then it swung to this pre-leasing. Is there a limit to kind of how far out pre-leases will be done? Or is it limited by land acquisition, or where's the edge?
Yeah, certainly some of it, there is a limit. I think that's related to capital dollars being spent, how far out in advance, you want to commit to that. The fact that while 3 years is a short time in the data center space, it's an eternity from a business, it can be a long time from a business perspective and how things change and acquiring other companies. And so I think there is a limit, but you bring up a really good point, which is we're getting to that point. We're getting to the point that, hey, it's just too far out for me to commit to. And historically, that's never been a challenge because the supply has been there. Yeah. And even if the supply was not there at that moment, it was coming, and now the question is like, hey, you've got a 50-acre site, that's great, but when does the power show up? And is this in phases or does it come in 2 large chunks? I mean, what does that look like? So those are the things that are impacting the decisions that that you're talking about from a timeline perspective. Yeah,
and that kind of dovetails into our next shift 3.
Do it.
Talking about just ways in which physically what people are developing is changing.
Yes.
The type of data center that people are making.
Yeah.
Again, driven in large part by large end users.
Yep.
Companies are willing to do things that they maybe weren't willing to do a couple of years ago. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there is actually that makes me think of, there is a spot in Santa Clara where you can stand. I'm not going to tell you what data center operator it is, but you can stand on the 4th floor of their data center facility, and you can see basically 3 directions, and you can actually see the evolution of data center construction. It's like a 1-story building, a 2-story building, you've got a 6-story building, and you're standing in a 4. And, one time when I was standing there, we were talking about how this is a really good view of how the industry has changed related to just the buildings and how many floors are in data center facilities. But it's changing at a larger level, which is, 10 years ago, data center campuses that were being bought were 20 acres, and it was 3 to 4 buildings. I remember in Dallas in 2010, Digital Realty's data center park in Richardson, that was an old Collins radio campus. They had a private substation, and they could master plan, I think it was 8 buildings on that campus. And now that's fully developed, fully leased. I mean, it's an awesome campus. Now, and that's 70 acres. Now companies are looking at buying hundreds of acres. Some even looking at 500 to 1,000 acre developments that they can build on for a long, long time. And I think that is a significant change. That obviously you can't put that type of land together, as you get close to the city. So it's typically in areas that are, undeveloped. But that's the type of view that people are taking today. 200 acres, 300 acres. There's a couple of groups looking at acquiring land in the southern part of Northern Virginia for 500 or 600 acres. So that's what we're seeing today, and I think that's what we'll see in the future, especially given some of the challenges with acquiring land parcels large enough to facilitate multi-story data center demand or multi-story data center construction, and the power that it takes to support it. And it's just not going away. That's something we will see moving forward.
And I think that reflects an even deeper commitment to being able to service the largest users in the space.
Yeah,
which makes sense. Again, if you look at the industry, it just makes perfect sense that that's who you would pursue.
Yep.
But and it doesn't seem to be a zero-sum game. There's going to be winners and losers. It almost feels like it's going to be winners and winners.
Totally.
Not to say that it's impossible to lose money in the space, but there is this I think is that type you describe is indicative of a general shift towards, hey, we really need to make sure we can service these larger users.
And it's understanding how they want to grow in the future. Part of the reason you've got to do something you've got to consider something like that if you're going to invest the capital to go buy that type of land is that the customers you're wanting to attract are going, hey, I know you can get us 3 buildings at 36 megawatts a building or 48 megawatts a building, but what will we do for the next 7? And that's one customer, and there's probably 10 to 20 customers in the world that have that type of, maybe even smaller than that have that type of requirement, but that's what you're trying to figure out how to accommodate. And you can't do that on a 30-acre site. You can't even do it on a 100-acre site long term, So anyway, that's the developments are changing that way. They're certainly changing on the sustainability side. There's continuing to be shifts on how to build, how to eliminate water, how to build with renewable energy and those type of things that our industry is heavily focused on. And I really don't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah, and again, that's once again related to the next one, site selection.
Yep.
That changing from like you mentioned, smaller parcels. Larger parcels necessitates a separate location.
Yep.
Proximity to power
Yep.
may necessitate a separate location. So talk a little bit about site selection shifts that you're seeing.
Yeah, one of the funny things that people in our space, this is probably 10 years ago, but everybody kind of thought they had a data center site. It was like, hey, we've got this 30 acres here, and I think it's good for data centers, and so that certainly isn't the case. If it was, land and site selection wouldn't be as important as it is today, because one of the reasons it's so important is it's really hard to find sites to accommodate this type of demand, from a size perspective, from a power perspective, from a location perspective. So a lot of the applications that the companies, the end users are working with, have latency requirements that have to be in certain geographies to make the applications work. And so if it gets beyond that, the application it breaks. The usage of the applications. And so that has pushed a big focus on how to acquire sites in a way that you can, have a large enough footprint to do what you need to do and not put out the capital needed until you really have to. That's one of the challenges with, buying land is like, how do I do it in a way that, I don't want to commit until I really need to commit.
Sure.
Because, if you certainly can buy land, but it doesn't produce any income until you built something and someone is leasing it. So that's a big shift, but I believe that you will see growth to different submarkets within within a larger market. Northern Virginia is a great example of that. But you even see it in Dallas, you even see it in Phoenix, starting to see it in Chicago, starting to see it in Portland, or in Hillsborough, out of Hillsborough. So that's happening. And I also think you could see it like from a market to another market. It's like, hey, we don't think that strategically, if we don't believe we can get 200 megawatts in this market over the next, 5 years, and we feel confident about that, we might need to shift that to another market. And I don't think we've seen that significantly, but I think it's probably something that's being talked about for sure.
Yeah, when we talk about the power side of it, though, I think in the past it was really bring the power to the land.
Yep.
And now that's been, given some recent crises.
It's tough. We could spend the whole podcast talking about crises and the plural and all that stuff.
Pejorative.
That's right.
And now we've seen a more trend of people going to where the power is. I think you mentioned one earlier. I can't remember what it was though. Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
South.
Yes. There's different plants that have, a lot of power that you could build within close proximity and shorten that timeline down.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean the idea that where you can, if you can put locations closer to where the power already is, you obviously solve one of the big problems that's going on right now. However, a lot of people think that you can just build something anywhere, right? Well, can't you just build the data center anywhere? I mean, it's a lights out facility. Not many people need to work there. You can do that, but number one, it's can you staff it? Number two, is there power? Is there, do you have the equipment to do it? And then also, too, does it meet the latency requirements?
Yeah.
And so that idea that you can build something, you can, but there's a cost to that. And a lot of times the cost is that the applications don't work. This is why the industry is where it is, because 15 years ago, these large companies were building, in random places, and that has shifted. And a lot of it is the connectivity. A lot of it is needing to be close to the people that they're providing the services to, and that comes down to site selection. Do you have the real estate to accommodate the demand? And I think one thing you will see is companies hiring teams of people to put multiple sites together to come up with a larger site in the right location.
I remember this was probably a year and a half ago. We were talking to a data center operator, and they said they had a whole the amount of time they were spending on power procurement had gone up 5x.
Yeah.
And this was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what that number is now.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Challenges,
higher.
Shifts,
yes.
Challenges, focus.
That's
right. All right.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes. You're playing a buzzword bingo.
Yes.
This is the new normal. We're not greenwashing this podcast. It's coming to you straight. All right. Last is international focus.
Yes.
That's something you mentioned as companies becoming more global. I think this was probably a year to year and a half ago. Digital, on one of their earnings calls, I think said they're deploying the majority of their new capital going overseas.
Sure.
So that's in some respects always happening, but there's been an inflection point recently of companies feeling the, I think, need to be able to service global requirements for some of these largest users.
Yeah, and I think the desire for end users has always been there to be able to globalize their infrastructure business in a way that supports their customers efficiently. I think the pandemic pushed the need for that. It's one thing to want it; it's another thing to need it and have to do it. And so, it has created the the need for the data center operator community to really grow internationally. And there's been some that have really taken some large steps. Most of the maturity, a lot of the maturity in our industry started in the U.S. and then it obviously has grown to other parts of the world. But a number of the U.S.-based data center operators historically had not been overseas. They had focused on the major markets here, some of the secondary markets, and that changed several years ago. One, because many of them got a lot more money, changed their strategy, wanted to make sure that they could accommodate some of these larger customers in areas internationally where they felt that pain. Most of the pain in the U.S. certainly is more than it was, but years and years ago, a lot of the data center users here thought they had the U.S. figured out. I don't think that probably is the case anymore, just related to the issues that are going on. But we have seen a number of those companies, push towards areas like Europe, areas like Africa, and not just buying land themselves, but acquiring other companies. Yeah. And that's been a big part of it as well.
I think we have some insight in this just based on some of the requests we get for Latin America, data, India, Africa to some extent, Middle East for sure, in addition to all the ones you just mentioned. So, it is clear that, and you can see from the press clippings, the companies that are either through acquisition or through organic growth that are pursuing these really globally.
We think about companies like QTS is a good example. Compass, Stack, Vantage has, I think I've talked about this before, but I remember when Vantage was like in Northern California and maybe somewhere in the Northwest, and now they've expanded by a lot. You mentioned Digital, Equinix, Yonder coming from headquartered in Europe and coming to the U.S. as an example of that. They're also in other international markets. So that's been a big part of it. And then also too, and probably one of the most important things is it does require local support. You really have to I'm speaking kind of not to any one group here, but like taking your way of doing things and just trying to jam that into another country does not seem to work that well.
So you need a Sherpa of sorts.
You need something.
You need a guide. I mean, you need someone who understands the local culture, how to get things done. You need a red.
Absolutely.
Man who knows how to get things.
That's right.
And you need one in Latin America, and you need one in Europe, and you need one in Africa, and you need one in India. So
when I was at DataCloud, I said in one of the discussions was about Latin America and growth specifically in Latin America. And this was one of the things that was talked about by each person on the panel was that if you think you're going to come down to Latin America and just buy a site and get a deal done with the power provider, it just doesn't work that way. You really need to understand how the municipalities work. You need to have people on the ground that can help you do the things you need to, and really know how the business culture works in those markets. And that's not just from a execution side of things. It's also from like a social support type of things. One of the big changes with the hyperscale companies in the last 10 years has been their ability to, instead of just putting up a facility with nothing on it and we don't want anyone to know we're here, there still is that maybe desire, but they are much more involved in the community. How can we support the community? What can we do to really build into the local community that we're a part of? So it helps you in both ways. It certainly helps you get your deal and your development done, but it also helps, ensuring that you've got the community support you're going to need from a resource perspective, because you are going to, be taking a lot of power, a lot of water, a lot of the things the resources that community has to offer.
Yeah, and you give back internet, which is awesome.
That's right. Yes.
The internet. Yes. Would you rather have a glass of water or Facebook, Instagram?
There we go.
I know how most.
It's a struggle.
That's a toss-up for a lot of people.
It's a struggle.
For real.
It's a struggle. Well, and I just say, kind of in closing, I mean, I think that, we've been in this industry now for over 15 years, and it's dynamic. and it's changing, and we've never been in a market like we're in right now. And it's not totally related to the pandemic. I mean, that added some interesting components to this, but it was happening almost before that. Yeah. And so I really am excited about the next 3 to 5 years, because it's almost like a new horizon, as it relates to what the new opportunities are, how the developments will change, who will be around in 3 to 5 years, who hasn't been purchased from consolidation standpoint. So, what markets will now be primary markets? I always think about these markets that 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, had like 2-3 facilities with 20 megs each, and now you've got like the market has quadrupled in size. So it's really exciting, and these 5 shifts that we talk about, I mean, it's real and it's happening.
Yeah, it's something that we're certainly keeping an eye on as far as what impact is this having. We've kind of identified it, but the impact of those is certainly playing out over time.
Yeah.
So something we're keeping an eye on. Anything else before we wrap up, Dave?
No, I think the next, at least to the end of the year, it's going to be really fun to watch the industry grow.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. For more information, go to datacenterhawk.com. We'd love to connect with you.